6. Moses, Exodus and the Law. In this lesson we must drastically condense the available material. Whole chapters will be covered by referring only to the highlights suggested below. The exodus of the children of Israel, their extensive wanderings and their eventual organization into a nation at sea form a very interesting and absorbing study. Genesis 15:13, 14. These verses contain the basis for the hope with which Moses inspired the enslaved Israelites. Refer to chart. Abram was called in 1921 BC. The Exodus took place in 1491 BC, 430 years later. Proof of the fulfillment of the prophecy in verse 13 is found in Exodus 12:40, 41. The prophecy in verse 14 was also literally fulfilled, see Exodus 3:22. Genesis 50:20-26. Joseph's dying words emphasize his complete faith in Israel's deliverance. His insistence on an oath that they would carry his bones to the land of promise has important implications. It shows his knowledge of God's promise to Abraham, as well as the prophecy concerning Israel's enslavement and later deliverance, see Hebrews 11:22. Joseph's remains did eventually rest in the land of promise. Exodus 1. Historical period 1716 BC. Cause of oppression, Israel prolific, prosperous and powerful. The land of Goshen obviously would soon be too small to contain the growing Hebrew race. Verse 8-16. The prophetical 400 years were coming to an end. A new pharaoh, from the old native Egyptian stock, rises to power. He afflicted Israel by forced labor, and to prevent their increase decreed that all newborn males be put to death. 1573 BC. Exodus 2. v1 Moses came from the tribe of Levi. VV 2-10 Birth of Moses, 1571 BC. Moses as a baby was miraculously saved. He later became the promised deliverer. VV 12-15 Exile of Moses, 1531 BC. An interesting way to divide the life of Moses. He was 40 years old when he first left Egypt. He returned 40 years later and led God's people out of Egypt. He lived 40 years after the Exodus. He died at 120 years of age. Exodus 3. This whole chapter is so important that it should all be considered. Moses dwells in Midian, in the vicinity of Seir, the place where he would later bring the children of Israel to receive the law. Special attention should be given to verses 14-16, Exodus 4. The important point in Exodus 4 is the miraculous power that was invested in Moses, to show the authority of his mission, both to his own people and to Pharaoh. The meeting of Moses and Aaron, verse 27. The acceptance of Moses by the children of Israel, verse 31. Exodus 5. Moses and Aaron bring the command of the Lord to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Pharaoh answers by increasing the workload of the Hebrews. Exodus 6, 1-30. God reiterates his intention to deliver his people, and encourages Moses by referring again to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Exodus 7. This chapter describes God's judgment upon Egypt in the form of 10 plagues. Details of these plagues are given in chapters 7-12. Note how they struck at the very root of Egyptian religious beliefs. For example, the river Nile was ecumenically the life of their country, and it was also one their many gods. The frog was the chief deity of Upper Egypt. The plagues demonstrated the superiority of the one God of the Hebrew slave people, over the many gods of their Egyptian taskmasters. Each plague successively weakened the morale of Pharaoh and his people, and gave added prestige and encouragement to the Israelites. The plagues were climaxed by the death of the firstborn of every living creature, man and beast in Egypt. Only the children of Israel in the land of Goshen escaped. Exodus 12. This chapter is of particular importance in providing the details concerning the Passover. Here we find an explanation of the events and ritual in connection with the Passover. We should be able to see its significance as a type of Christ's sacrifice represented by the lamb, and by the blood on the doorposts of the Hebrew dwellings. This connection is supported in I-Cor 5, 7, 8. Exodus 13. The Exodus 1491 BC. v19. A point of interest. Moses fulfills Israel's obligation regarding Joseph's bones. Exodus 14. Verse 4. Note God's declaration, I will be honored. This is a fundamental principle in the relationship between God and man. Verse 21. Here we find a description of the events in connection with the crossing of the Red Sea. This event was so dramatic that it became a historic landmark demonstrating God's power to save to the uttermost. Psalm 78, 13. Acts 7:36. Organization of God's people under the law. Exodus 16-18. These chapters describe the journey of the children of Israel from the shores of the Red Sea to Sinai. In chapter 16 we read of the murmuring of the people and God's patience with them. His provision of food in a strange new form caused them to exclaim in wonder, "What is this?" The word manna is derived from this expression. In the 6th chapter of John, verses 30-35, Jesus shows the significance of manna as the type of the true bread, which God has provided for us in the person of His Son. Exodus 17. The highlight in this chapter is the episode where the people murmur against Moses for lack of water. God commands Moses to smite the rock at Horeb. He strikes the rock as directed, and water comes forth to satisfy the needs of the people. In this chapter, Israel meets their first opposition on the journey to Canaan in a battle with Amalek. Exodus 18. Verse 18-24. Jethro's wise counsel induces Moses to begin the organization of his people. Exodus 19-31. These chapters outline in detail the law which was to govern Israel's political, social, economic and religious life throughout their history. Chapters 19 and 20 are especially interesting, describing God's prestatio of the Ten Commandments and the law. Emphasis can be traced on verses 5 and 6 of chapter 19. Chapters 21-31 provide details and specifications for the tabernacle, its furnishings and the priestly functions. Exodus 32-33. These chapters describe the idolatry which broke out in the camp during the absence of Moses, and the punishment that followed. Exodus 34. The tables of stone which Moses had broken on his return to the camp are replaced by another set which Moses received on a second ascent to the summit of Mount Sinai. Particular emphasis can be given to God's patience as demonstrated in verse 7. Exodus 35-40. Throughout these chapters we find the information regarding the actual construction of the tabernacle, its contents and details regarding the priest's garments. Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is concerned with the function of the Levites, the priests and the offerings connected with the tabernacle worship. It also describes various rituals, laws and ordinances. Numbers. The Israelites moved from the vicinity of Sinai and took up their journey to the borders of the Holy Land. The 12 spies searched out the land and their discouraging report caused the people to murmur. For this reason, the Israelites were prevented from entering the land. They are forced to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until that particular generation passed away. Numbers 20. This chapter contains an important episode. Notice here how Israel provoked Moses and the disastrous consequences it brought about. Verse 12, Moses loses his opportunity to lead God's people into the Holy Land. Numbers 21. We have here an event which has prophetical significance. In this chapter we learn of the circumstances which caused Moses to make a brazen serpent. This will be helpful when we consider the sacrifice of Christ. We can turn to the reference found in John 3:14-15 to see the connection. Deuteronomy 34. This chapter brings us to the end of Israel's 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Moses views the land of promise from the top of Mount Nebo. He dies in faith, confident that his eyes would once again, under more favorable circumstances, behold the land promised to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. This 34th chapter in all probability, must have been written by Joshua as it is an account of Moses' death. The children of Israel now stand on the banks of the Jordan with a new leader, Joshua, who is a type of Christ. He will lead them into the Holy Land. Archaeology, Balaam's plaster fragment. Posted on Tuesday, December the 17th at 00:00 Ist. Topic: Archaeology. In February and March of 1967, H. J. Frake was conducting excavations at Deir Allah in the Jordan River Valley when his vigilant foreman, Abu Abdul Rasul, noticed writing on pieces of plaster being removed from the remains of an ancient building. He brought the information to the excavator 1. This inscription, dated approximately 700 BC, is a narrative concerning the Old Testament non-Israelite prophet Balaam, well known to Bible students as the prophet who dominates Numbers 22-24. The region in which the 119 total fragments were discovered is known as the biblical location of the Valley of Succos, PS 60, 8, 108, 89, and near the proximity of the plains of Moab where Balaam had an encounter with the Israelites too. The plaster fragments record portions of biblical history that render even more credibility to the accuracy of the Bible. 1. The fragments text repeatedly refer to Balaam son of Beor and describe him as a divine seer. Balaam gave us a fascinating non-Israelite perspective from those who conquered Ka'atu. From the language and dialect of the tablets, we can clearly see that they seem to have been written not by an Israelite as was the biblical story of Joshua, but rather by a non-Israelite, probably a Moabite or Midianite. What we have found, says the Jerusalem historian, seems to dramatically confirm the biblical narrative. This momentous discovery seems to confirm the existence of the prophet Balaam, an epic figure of the Bible and a contemporary of Moses. Note, references: 1. Balaam, a light to the Gentiles, Dr. Glenn Carnegie, Chafer University, chafer.edu/journal/IFE8D22, HTM2 3000-year-old fragments parallel biblical narrative, Jerusalem Christian Review, Martin L. Oxford, securesite.net/ss2add/past/main 106.htm, 3. Professor Oyomazar, Hebrew University, quoted in reference to _archaeology_. Portions of this website are reprinted from other sources under the Fair Use Doctrine of International Copyright Law, Title 17, Chapter 1, Section 107, as educational material without benefit of financial gain. For more information, see Cornell Law School at http://www.law.cornell.edu/uscode/17/107.html